Now that we have our GUI set up, we're going to go ahead and put together our weapons. So I'm going to set this up into two different videos. The first one, we're going to create all of our mono behavior stubs. When I say stub, I mean we're going to put it in their public fields and their basic methods, and then we are going to go back into Unity, configure a bunch of prefabs, and hook them up to our player. Then in the next video, we will go ahead and write out the code to actually make our weapons fire. So the way I'm going to do this is our weapons, which I will be referring to as basic weapons. And the reason I'm doing that is they are different from something like a missile or a mine. Instead, a basic weapon is something that is fired from a position to a direction, and because of that, that's how our API for our basic weapons is going to look. What's good?
Yeah, basically this is something different than a missile that would track somebody or something like that.
Right. The purpose of this part is just to figure out our basically our primary weapons, you could say, in a game like this. So what's going to happen is we're going to have two different turret mounts, which I'm going to place on these exhaust intakes, because that looks like the most appropriate place for them to go on this model. That was a small stab at Steve, but
Yeah, nobody told me they needed weapon mounts.
that's all right. So I'm going to place them on these exhaust intakes, and what they are going to be are they're going to be mounts, and mounts can have different kinds of basic weapon types attached to them, and those basic weapon types will be responsible for instantiating prefabs, which will constitute the actual projectiles. So to do this, we need a couple classes. I'm going to go into click on Visual Studio. I'm going to be creating these classes from within Visual Studio, and the reason I'm doing that is so we get our namespaces all set up properly, and we don't get any of that stuff that Unity generates for me that I always delete anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and create a class, and I'm going to name the first one Basic Weapon. Now the cool thing about the way this class is going to look is actually going to be abstract. When I say class is abstract, I mean it can't be directly instantiated. Instead, what you do is you have to create classes that inherit from this. This isn't a video about object-oriented programming, but if you want to learn more about the abstract keyword, go ahead and look at some, tutorial into inheritance or something to that effect. But you'll at least be able to see what we're able to do with it. Because basic weapon is going to inherit from mono behavior. So it's abstract, but it inherits from mono behavior. That means anything that inherits from basic weapon is a mono behavior, which is going to be a really useful bit of behavior when writing very reusable code inside of Unity. Now, the basic weapon class is essentially going to have one method on it, which is going to be abstract. It's going to be called fire. And fire will take in a vector3 position and a vector3 direction. So like I said, a basic weapon is a weapon that can be fired from a position to a direction. The position is going to be where a turret mount is on our ship, and the direction is going to be where our mouse cursor is in relation to the center of the screen. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and create our basic weapon type that we are going to be using throughout this series, and that's going to be our projectile weapon. So I'm going to say projectile weapon. Now, a projectile weapon is a basic weapon, so I'm going to have it inherit from it, but you'll notice that the code won't compile until I provide an implementation of fire. In this case, it's going to be an empty implementation. Note that the fire method on basic weapon is abstract, therefore it does not have an actual definition. The definition is left up to be implemented by the classes that inherit it, which in this case projectile weapon is going to provide its own implementation for fire. I'm also, for some reason, Visual Studio decided to not import that namespace, so I'm going to bring that in up there using Unity Engine at the top. Now, what makes a projectile weapon a projectile weapon? Well, a projectile weapon is going to have a couple things. It's going to have a public projectile prefab. Now, the projectile class hasn't been made yet. We'll look at that in a moment. And it's also going to have a public float of quite a few different parameters. The reason I'm doing this way is to take advantage of the way that prefabs work inside of Unity. By creating a projectile weapon like this with a bunch of configurable parameters, we're able to sort of mix and match our different projectile prefabs with different parameters, allowing us to create all sorts of projectile weapons from just this one class. So again, this is this is pretty much an example of how to write fairly reusable code within Unity. Now, the parameters that a projectile weapon will have, besides prefab, is going to be our speed, which is not spelled like that. It's not spelled like that either. It's spelled like that. Damage, which is how much damage this projectile will do. Fire rate, which is the rate in which this weapon will fire. That's just kind of obvious based off the name. And time to live. Time to live is the maximum amount of seconds a projectile fired from this weapon will stay alive in the scene. After that time expires, it will destroy itself. So that's our projectile weapon stub. We're not going to be writing the fire implementation quite yet. Next up, let's go ahead and do our projectile stub. As you see, I use it right there on line 7, but I haven't defined it yet. So I'm going to write a class called projectile. Now, projectile is going to inherit from mono behavior because it will be a mono behavior. So let's go ahead and get that in there, and that'll bring in a using Unity engine at the top. Now, the projectile class itself is really going to have one method. It's going to be public void init. Now, the init method is going to accept a projectile weapon. That's where it's going to retrieve certain parameters. It's also going to take in a vector3 direction. So that's really it for the projectile itself. And these three classes constitute most of our weapon system, but we need one more class, and that class is going to be our weapon mount. And the weapon mount will allow us to equip basic weapons. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a class called basic weapon mount. Basic weapon mount will be a mono behavior, as it will be a component that we will be attaching to game objects that are attached to our player. Note the using statement. Now, the basic weapon mount will have, it'll simply have a public void method called equip. And equip will take in a basic weapon called weapon prefab. So basically what the equip method is going to do is it's going to instantiate a basic weapon prefab and use its fire method, which we will also go ahead and write out here. So fire will take in a vector3 direction. Now the fire method on the basic weapon mount does not need to take in a position, as the position is inferred from the transform of the basic weapon mount itself. Now the final bit of code that we're going to write in this video isn't going to be a new class, but instead it's going to be a property on the player. Now the player needs to be aware of the basic weapon that it's going to at least start with. Now the way I've written this is to make sure that we're able to equip different weapons throughout the course of the game, but for this particular game we're going to need to know which basic weapon prefab that we are going to equip our mounts with by default when the game starts. So I'm going to say public basic weapon, and I'm simply going to call it basic weapon. So now that we have these four classes written, and we have our stubbed out at least, we have our public property on our player, public field, we can jump into Unity and hook all this stuff together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new scene. The reason I'm creating a new scene is when I construct prefabs, I typically like to have my own scene to do that in, so I don't have to mess around with or at least collide with the other objects that I might have in my other scene. So I'm going to save the scene out into scenes garbage, and I'm going to call the scene scratch. Except my scratch scene, like a scratch sheet of paper or something like that. So yeah, so let's go ahead and put together our basic projectile first, and then we'll put together our projectile type, and then we'll hook it all up into our player. So let's go ahead and hit create empty, and I'm going to position this game object at the origin. And then I'm going to create another game object of type capsule, going to parent it to game object, and make sure that capsule is also positioned at the origin. Then I'm going to make sure that the capsule is going to be pointing down the z-axis, and I know that because I just I don't know if you guys noticed, but I positioned my camera on my in my scene view in such a way that the z-axis is pointing away from me. That way I know that that's the direction I need to rotate in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it forward in the x-axis so that it's pointing down the z-axis. Again, when you have a convention of where you consider to be forward in your game, it makes things a whole lot easier. Also, I am doing the same thing I did with my player in that I'm adding the mesh as a child to the game object that'll actually have the behavior associated with it. That is so that the game object's transform is an identity transform, meaning its position is zeroed out, its rotation is zeroed out, and its scale is, well, not zeroed out, but it's the identity, because the identity of multiplication is 1. And I do that so that we can manipulate the mesh independently of this transform. And we can manipulate this transform independently of our mesh transform.
Sweet.
All right, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to first scale this down a little bit. Then I'm going to, let's create a material for it. That sounds like fun. So I'm going to open up materials. I'm going to say create folder. Let's create a projectiles folder inside of our materials folder, under which I'm going to create a material. Now, the projectile that I'm going to refer to this as is level 1, implying that if you wanted to create multiple projectile types, you are more than welcome to do so. So then I'm going to click and drag this material onto my mesh, which will set its mesh renderer to use this material, and that means I can now manipulate its color to whatever I want.
Photon torpedo.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. We're going to be replacing this with particle effects later, but I just kind of want to like make it look a little bit more interesting than gray. Maybe we can also make it we can make it a specular too, make it shiny with a nice little. I'm spending too much time doing this, aren't I?
Yeah, it's worth it to be shiny.
Yeah. So now we have a shiny little capsule dude, and he's awesome. Okay, so now that we have our shiny little capsule dude, I'm going to remove the capsule collider from the child component. I'm going to keep the mesh renderer on and the mesh filter on, of course. And that's all I'm going to have to do with the child. Now, with the parent I am going to rename to level 1. Although that doesn't, that's just you know, naming conventions. And when we prefabify it, it'll turn into the level 1 prefab.
Sweet.
Yep. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to add the collision detection components directly to the parent level 1 game object. So we're going to need a rigid body. Now, the reason we need a rigid body is that this will be moving along in the scene. Now, this isn't like a bullet that you would have in a first-person shooter where you would cast a ray to do damage. This is something that it's going to run slow enough for you to actually see move across space. So we are going to have to add physics simulation to it. I add a rigid body to it so that it gets picked up by Unity's physics simulation so that it can perform collision detection. However, we definitely don't want it to use gravity because, well, that wouldn't make any sense.
It'll drop out the bottom of our game.
Yeah. But we do want to set it to is kinematic. And we want to set it to is kinematic is because we are going to be performing our own calculations on its movement. The next thing we need is we need a collider, which I'm going to do a capsule collider. Now, the capsule collider, when I added it to the parent, got a little confused. Whenever you add a capsule collider to a game object, or any collider for that matter, Unity will do its best to estimate how the collider should be configured. However, it got a little confused because it thinks the direction is in the y-axis, when in fact we've changed the direction of the mesh to the z-axis. So that's very easy to fix. I can simply say direction on the z-axis, and then I can take its height down, or sorry, its radius down, and its height down, and we now have a collider attached to the parent. So that means that the scripts that we attach onto the parent class as it moves along in space will be informed of collisions.
Perfect.
Alrighty, so now that we have our collision components attached to it, let's go ahead and add our projectile component onto it, which doesn't need any configuration. And that pretty much completes our level 1 projectile. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a folder called prefabs. I'm going to create a subfolder called projectiles. Then I'm going to click and drag level 1 into that folder. Now we have a level 1 projectile prefab that we can use to instantiate our projectiles as we shoot our weapons. Okay, so next up, I'm going to delete that game object now that we've already effectively saved it as a prefab, and I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to create empty. Now, the actual position doesn't matter on this prefab. This prefab, the only reason I'm going to be creating it is so that I can pre-configure a projectile weapon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the empty game object, and I'm going to click and drag projectile weapon up here onto the inspector, and it's going to allow me to configure a specific kind of projectile. So let's go ahead and fill out all of its properties. The first property it needs to know what prefab to instantiate to create a projectile in the game. So I'm going to click and drag level 1 up here onto the prefab property there. Next one is at speed. I'm going to give it 200. Damage, let's give it 10 damage, or that's 19. How about 10? How about 10? There we go. A fire rate of 0.09 and a time to live of 2 seconds. So, yeah, now we've created
Very nice.
our first projectile weapon.
Alrighty.
So I'm going to, under prefabs, I'm going to create another folder called basic weapons. And under basic weapons, I'm going to click and drag this game object into that folder. Before I do, however, I will rename it to basic level 1 projectile. Or how about just level 1 projectile? Then I click and drag that onto my basic weapons folder, and I now have a level 1 projectile basic weapon prefab. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove that out of the scene because we don't need it anymore. And let's jump back into our game test scene so we can set up our player. Moving back into game test, if you recall, we need to position 2 game objects onto our player that constitute the turrets that will be firing our level 1 projectile. So to do that, I'm going to go to game object, create empty. I'm going to attach it to my player. Then I'm going to rename it to turret 1. Now I'm going to position it into those little exhaust intakes. So to do that, I'm going to switch into an orthographic view on a particular axis, and I'm going to position it like that. I'm going to move into another axis. We went way down there, didn't we? Make sure it all lines up, and it does.
Very nice.
Then I'm going to click and drag basic weapon mount onto it. Then I'm going to select it, hit Control D, move it along the x-axis over to the other exhaust intake, and then I'm going to rename it to projectile or turret 2. And that should be on the same on the other axes, so yeah, it indeed looks correct. So I'll switch back into perspective view and zoom out, and we can see that our turret 1 and turret 2s are positioned appropriately. Now the final thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to tell our player which basic weapon that he's going to be using at the start of the game. So to do that, I'm going to click on the player, and then I'm going to scroll down to his basic weapon property. I'm going to click and drag level 1 projectile on top of it. So now that I've done that, our player will now use that basic weapon at the start of the game. Of course, all of that work actually did nothing because we still can't shoot anything. So,
We're not there yet.
yep, let's go ahead and write some code.